we thought we'd release something a little bit different to our usual posts on our social media pages. We've released a podcast where our press officer Nick Porter and I sat down with coastal scientist Professor Andy Plater from the University of Liverpool. We spoke about some of the natural processes that take place on our beaches and addressed some important questions related to the tide at Southport and ploughing the beach. Yep, that's right. Listen to the episode to find out more. Enjoy. Very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Well, perhaps we could start with you telling us a little bit about your research that you do at the university.
Sure. So my research is more about looking at how coastlines respond to various driving forces like storms, waves, tides, sea level rise, and how that's moderated by the amount of sediment that's in place. So it's all about how those forces move sediments around to form beaches, salt marshes, dunes, etc. And I'm kind of interested in how that response during the recent past and the geological past tells us about how things are going to respond in the future. So it's understanding those dynamics and then using past response as a predictive tool for future coastal change as a result of sea level rise and changes in storm magnitude frequency.
Which is why I thought you'd be the perfect guest to talk about some of the more natural processes that take place on our beach.
We'll see.
Yes, we will see indeed. So I thought we'd start with dispelling some myths. So Southport is known by many visitors and many inhabitants as, well, the sea's a long way out, I'll say that, and it never actually reaches the seawall. But we know it does. Why does it? Why does it appear so far out? And what causes it to come a bit closer to home?
Yeah, that's something that I learned very early on when I moved into the region, which is a fair few years ago, is that people said, oh, the tide never comes in at Southport. But we know that that certainly isn't the case. It's due to the fact that the tide rises and falls during the day, twice per day. It's called a semi-diurnal tide. And because it rises and falls such a lot over a very shallow sloping beach, tidal flat, it goes a long way out, and it takes a substantial while, I suppose, to make it from that long way out to the shoreline. But we know at high tide that it does get in, it does come up to the beachfront. It probably doesn't on every tide. I would imagine that on certain neap tides, basically a neap tide is when your tidal range, the difference between high and low water, is less than on a spring tide where you've got a greater range between high and low water. So on neap tides, it doesn't necessarily mean that the high tide will cover the entire shoreline, but certainly on spring tides, it will make it up to the coast, up to the shore. So it is a total nonsense in a way that the sea never comes in at Southport. It goes a long way out and then comes a long way back in again. But people who live here are very familiar with that.
Yeah, because you get two extremes, I think, Nick. You have, it can take, a couple of miles to launch sometimes at low water.
Yeah, definitely on a low water spring. It can be 2 miles from where we are at next to the pier to our launch site, and it also uncovers a lot of other things in our area that we get to, say, with the quad bites. For example, from the new lifeboat station here, we can go 5 miles north before we reach any sort of water in the Ribble estuary, which is, obviously we get a lot of people who get caught out thinking that they can walk to Blackpool from here, and if you get 5 miles and then realise you can't, and then it's a long way back with the tide chasing you.
And then we've had the other side of it. We've had the D class underneath the pier, so you do get those two extremes, but it makes it quite an interesting environment to work in for sure.
I mean, it's not atypical of the region, to be honest. You walk around Liverpool Bay and you do have that extensive tidal flat over a lot of the coastline. It's kind of a characteristic of this part of the world in terms of having these large tidal flats, but I suppose it's particularly well illustrated here.
So why do we have these large tidal flats? Why is it such a wide, flat beach?
That's a really interesting question in a way, and it's all to do with tidal dynamics. So out in the open sea, the tide only really rises and falls by about half a metre. But when you get into the coast, it increases as a result of something known as attenuation. So the tide is just like a giant wave. It's a long wave. And as it moves into shallow water, it gets attenuated, which means it gets shorter and higher. And when you've got a shelf sea, like the Irish Sea or the North Sea, that almost like exaggerates that difference in height between the crest of that wave and the trough of the wave. So in shelf seas, you get bigger tides. And that's particularly true at places like the Bay of Fundy, the Bristol Channel, Ungava Bay, and here in the northwest as well. So, our tidal range can get up to 10 metres, and that's largely as a result of it being a shallow water bay that causes that attenuation of the tide, making the tide range bigger.
These shelf seas, are they related to plate tectonics?
To some extent, yes, because where you have plate tectonics, you've got active coastline, so it means that you don't tend to have a continental shelf. So the sea is very deep, close to the shoreline. But where you don't have active plate tectonics, you have an extensive continental shelf, which is a large area of relatively shallow water. So we have a pretty good continental shelf here in northwest Europe, which extends a good way out. So most of the seas in proximity to any British coastline is situated on the continental shelf. So we don't have deep water in close proximity to our shoreline. So that yes, you're right. Indirectly, it does have an impact on it.
And on the topic of tides, something that we experience here is this gradual northwards movement of tidal current. What causes that, and why is it different in, say, like the northern hemisphere compared to the southern hemisphere?
Well, now we're getting into complex territory now, because
we're only a few minutes in as well.
I know. So that's an incredibly interesting question, because when you think of the tide coming in and out, you just think of all of a sudden there's loads of water there, and then all of a sudden there isn't. So where does the water go? So we don't have these massive amounts of water all of a sudden evaporating or going down a hole somewhere else. Within a shelf sea, the tide actually rotates, and it rotates as a result of Coriolis. So I don't know if you're familiar with Coriolis, but in the northern hemisphere, if you were a fluid and you were trying to move in a straight line in the northern hemisphere, it would push you out to the right hand side. If you're doing it in the southern hemisphere, it would push you out to the left hand side. I sometimes think that the only time you notice Coriolis is if you had a few beers and you're under the influence of the Earth's gravitational field, and so it will veer you off in a direction rather than being able to travel in a straight line. But that's just my theory. I'm not sure whether that's right or not. So a tide, when it's trying to move in and out of a shelf sea, the Coriolis shifts it off in a direction which actually causes it to rotate. So in the Irish Sea and in the North Sea, the tide doesn't just come in and go out. It actually rotates around that sea in an anti-clockwise direction. So if you imagine a tide rotating around the Irish Sea in an anti-clockwise direction, it's actually operating along the shoreline, moving things from south to north. And even though on an ebb, you'd think it would go in the opposite direction, it's not, because it's still rotating in that direction. So even on the ebb, it still goes in that north-south. It's not always in the same vector, but it still has that overall net direction of movement.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, because we get a lot of searches off here for people in the water, and when we're deciding where to search, we have a last known position, and then the Coast Guard have a software where they'll input the data, and they can sort of predict using the which way the currents generally go as to a new search area. And in the past, we've been somewhere and we're like, this can't be right. We're miles from where we think we should be searching, and sure enough, it's we come across them. And the other thing we tend to find is it's a bit more morbid, but if we get unfortunately we get people who jump off, say, the Great Orme off North Wales, and they tend to end up on the beach here. Somebody we lose here tends to end up at Blackpool. It's the sad side of it, but that's part of the job we do.
I mean, that's although sad, it's interesting in the fact that you can predict those tidal dynamics. They're kind of well known, and you can put them into numerical models. And so, depending on your state of the tide, it's relatively, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's relatively straightforward to predict where the vector over the next couple of hours might be taking something that is floating or immediately beneath the surface. So it's interesting to kind of use that physical understanding of the tide in relation to an application that
Yeah.
is going to point you in the right direction, looking for a victim or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's something that you're very aware of when you're doing a search as well. The movement of the water and forecasting or predicting where someone or something might be. But it's good to know the reason for that as well, linking it, like you say. Yeah, so we've had a tour of the station and we've had a look out to sea, and it is one of those days where the tide is quite far out, and you can see it reveals this vast beach. But while it appears very flat, it is actually riddled with these sandbanks. And we actually launched a campaign called the It's Behind You campaign, which aims to educate people about the risks of becoming cut off by the tide and how it happens. But why are beaches like this? Why are they actually full of these undulations and smaller channels? Why does that take place?
Well, you're full of complex questions. Actually, that's another one in a
Better
way.
yet to come.
Exactly. I kind of like that one. I think it's all to do. Well, I know it's all to do with the fact that when a fluid moves over a bed, it organises it. So basically, here we can imagine the tidal flat as being a bed composed of individual particles, and when a fluid moves over that, it moves those particles in the direction that it's travelling, and it orders them. So if you've ever walked on a beach, you'll find ripples, and that's where the waves are organising the particles to form these linear ridges, well, depending on its waves, whether it's waves or whether it's currents. And if you get a faster flow, a tidal flow, for example, you can get something called mega ripples or sound waves, and they can be kind of like 30 centimetres high, maybe 2 to 5 metres in wavelength. And then the biggest bed forms are the kind of things that we see on this, what's known as a multi-barred foreshore. It's basically sandbars, which are these large sedimentary features that migrate. So that's the essence of the tide bringing sediment forward as it moves forward, as it comes towards the shoreline. And then as it drops off that, it will reveal these sandbars where you've got peaks and troughs. And people think that they're quite static. And I suppose over the long term, on the short term, they might appear static, but on the long term, you can see that they migrate. Say, for example, if you look at the Iron Men down at Crosby, you can see that they were put in on the existing undulations and the shoreline, right? And then N months later, those existing undulations have moved to another place. So some of those Iron Men have been exposed by several meters, others have almost been buried up to their heads. So these sedimentary features are on the move, but they can be almost imperceptible on a day-to-day basis. You have to look at things in that longer term to be able to see how they move.
I know one of our ex-crew members, he did a dissertation on Ainsdale Beach, and it involved him walking out from a set location to the first channel. They'd mark it a distance, and they go to the second channel, and it seems to be at Ainsdale. There's always 3 channels, and they move closer in, and then the closest one will eventually disappear, and a new one will have formed behind it. So it's really quite interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's another interesting thing as well, because those bars, when they're exposed and when they get close to the shoreline, they provide all sorts of sediment for the wind to entrain and take into the sand dunes. And so when a bar gets in close proximity to the shoreline, all of a sudden you have this large supply of sediment and the dunes will build up. But then when you have that wet trough, your supply of sediment is much more reduced and the dunes don't build up. So you get these episodes of dune building related to the fact that these bars are migrating on shore, and when they kind of land on shore, all of a sudden all of this sand's available for dune building, and when it's a trough, then it's much more limited. So it's an interesting, almost like unseen element of the dynamics. It's the slow and progressive dynamics rather than what you might see on a day-to-day basis.
Talking about the movement of sediment, am I right in saying that here the beach profile it's aggrading, whereas, well, actually on the west coast it's aggrading, but on the east coast there's more erosion taking place?
I wouldn't be quite so simplistic in subdividing one shoreline as opposed to another, just on relation to where they are. Mm-hmm. But you kind of are right. I think if you look at our shorelines here, we don't have too many issues associated with coastal erosion. We kind of have a surplus of sediment. And that's largely due to the tidal dynamics. We have that supply of sediment to the coastline, which means that it's building up or aggrading or prograding, if you think about it. If you look out at the shoreline here, we've got loads of evidence of the fact that beach is building up and it's building outwards. So in essence, the low tide's getting further away to some extent. And we also see that when the beach builds up to a certain level, it starts to become vegetated. It's not covered by the tide for many minutes of any day. So it means that it can become vegetated as a result of that. So a beach that is aggrading and prograding is one where there's lots of sediment, and at a point it might become vegetated to form a green beach or a salt marsh, which locally can be a bit of a pain because your nice sandy beach turns into a rather muddy vegetated beach, which probably isn't quite as attractive, but it might be more attractive for wildlife or for migrating birds. So perhaps that's the trade-off that you might have to bear.
Well, it's quite interesting because if where we're sat here in our new lifeboat station 100 years ago, this was the beach, and we've got evidence if we go into Rotten Row, which is a quarter of a mile inland from here, is the old sea wall, and it's still there. The pier used to start at the beach, and now half of it's overland. So obviously, at some point in the past 100 years, the people of Southport, whoever, have reclaimed this land. Is it reaching a point where we should be thinking about reclaiming it, or is it? Is that one that might upset the ecologists?
I think that's a very good point. Yes, yeah, because reclamation always loses intertidal to supratidal habitat, and those habitats are incredibly valuable, not just for things that live here, but things that migrate through here. So reclamation does tend to result in that loss of habitat. But I think one of the reasons why we're kind of I think the mood music is against reclamation is that sea level is rising. So this balance between things accreting or aggrading and forming salt marshes, well, that might only be a temporary measure because sea level's rising, and as a result, we might get a return back to a sandy beach. So I think I'd argue about intervening in any way at the moment. And plus, the more we put hard infrastructure in the way, like a seawall, the more we put our space at risk from inundation during storms. So it's best to give the sea space for flooding. So round the corner here in the Ribble at Hesketh Bank, they've done something called managed realignment, where they've basically breached the seawall to enable the tide to flood into what was originally reclaimed farmland. So I think the kind of pressures of the day are much more towards finding space for the sea to rise into and for flooding to take place, where you don't then threaten urban or industrial infrastructure. And I think I'm waffling on a bit here, aren't I? I think at the same time we have to recognise that the coast always changes. The point that we're making here is that the sea defence structures are located further inland from here, but at the same time we can go to Hightown, and you walk out on the intertidal zone at Hightown, and you walk over a buried forest. So it's currently the sea, but it was actually a woodland with regal ferns and birch and alder. So you put it into that context, you think, well, yeah, over the long term there are these oscillations in the shoreline which we have to think about when we're perhaps acting in over the shorter term. And maybe what we're seeing here at Southport, which is exactly what we're seeing at Hoylake, which is exactly what the people at Parkgate saw 20 or 30 years ago, is one of those episodes of beach build-up and vegetation. But sea level rise is likely to put paid to that. So leave as is for the moment. And okay, it's a bit unfair of me to say grin and bear it, because I don't live at the coastline and I don't have to put up with all of the smells and then midges, etc., etc. But yeah, I look at all coastlines and I love them equally.
The right answer. There's lots of comments get made, particularly on our social media pages, about how we can restore the beach to what you might see as a traditional sandy beach.
Yeah.
And a common intervention seems to be to plough the beach. What would your thoughts be on ploughing the marshland to to turn it back into a nice sandy beach?
I'm not sure it would work, to be honest. I think it would be a temporary intervention which would just work against the natural phase of accretion and terrestrialization. Let's call it that. The beach becomes land through a period of being a salt marsh. I know in the D estuary, for example, when they introduced a species called Spartina, it just spread over the whole of the salt marsh, and they were thinking, well, we need to do something about this. So then put loads of weed killer on it to try and cut it back, and it was just useless. It was just a temporary measure that really didn't make any difference. So whilst I could see that it would be an interesting intervention to go with in relation to ploughing up the beach or stripping off the salt marsh and taking it to landfill somewhere, I don't think it would have any long-term benefit, and it would just happen again. Just wait for sea level to rise.
Mm-hmm. I think the common theme might be let nature take its course.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is coincidence, 'cause I'm not, I'm not a geographist or anything by trade, but obviously there's been a lot of work done in the Mersey in recent years. They built the new L2 terminal for the shipping containers, which involved a lot of dredging of the silt and sediment from the Mersey, and they took it out to the spoil area, which is just off the coast here, and dropped it. Now, as we were saying before, with the currents bringing stuff north, we seem to find that particularly the area around between the seawall and the end of the pier where we launch our boat, or along our launch route, became very muddy very quickly, and there was some comments that this could be due to the dredging, and these sediments are just getting washed straight back up on Southport Beach. Is that as simplistic as that, or is it other things at play causing the
There's certainly potential for it, because if you dredge large volumes of material like they had to do for L2, and you don't dispose of it in the right place at the right time, it can be transported by the tide to where you don't want it to be. So there's potential for it. But I think, again, we referred back earlier to tidal dynamics and how they can be modelled. You can effectively model where the release of dredge spoil in a certain location at a certain time of the tide, where it would be likely to end up. So strictly speaking, if it's properly regulated, it shouldn't happen. And also, you've got to think about the volume of material which is being dredged compared with the volume of material which is ending up on the shoreline. So I know, for example, that the training works on the entrance to the Mersey, a good while ago, this is centuries ago, that required dredging, and the disposal of the dredge spoil, it was suggested that was responsible for the accretion of Formby Point, that Formby Point grew as a result of almost like a human intervention that added sediment into the system. But I think now, when you look at the relative volumes, it would be really hard for that activity, which is localized in space, to create such a large volume of material that would lead to Formby Point secretion. But I'm not saying that it couldn't be the case here. I mean, I kind of think that what you have here to the north of the pier is more about the interaction of the tide with the ribble. So when you get that mixing of fresh and seawater, fine-grained particles which would otherwise remain in suspension kind of stick together. There's like an electrolytic force. Basically, individual clay particles have negative charges on them. Or is it positive? Can't remember which one. But when you put them in seawater, they negate those charges and they can stick together. So you get something known as a turbidity maximum. And here we've obviously got that interface between fresh water and seawater. So you can get a turbidity maximum. But just in answer to your point there, it will always have been there. So why would that make such a difference all of a sudden? So it might be part of this continuing phenomena of the terrestrialization of the beach in combination with the supply of fine-grained sediments from the ribble. But it could also be an artifact of dredging. So a nice way of addressing that would be to do some work that looks at the geochemistry of those clay particles, of those sand particles, to find out where they've come from. So you can characterize different sources of material, and you can compare it with what's being deposited, so you know where it comes from. So something known as sediment provenance would be a nice thing to do to explore what you think may be happening in relation to the characteristics of those source materials.
It probably can't go out on the podcast because I might be done for libel, but there's a story that my uncle told me of a company who were responsible for dredging, and they placed the spoil within the wave base, or within that active zone, knowing full well that it will come back to where they picked it up from.
Yeah.
Just so they had a continuous supply of sediment, so that they had a full-on job, really, so they could just carry on picking up the sediment, drop it off, it'll come back, pick it up, drop it
Well,
off.
you're putting yourself in a job for life there, but exactly the same used to happen at Dungeness, where they had erosion of the shoreline along the south coast and the deposition of that gravel on its eastern promontory. So to prevent any kind of threat to the coastal infrastructure there, which includes a nuclear power station and a fairly important substation as well, they used to employ a company to collect the sediment from the eastern shoreline and put it back where it came from. So it's like that was another job for life. So I'm not saying that the irresponsible disposal of dredgeboard doesn't happen, but it shouldn't.
Yeah. Yeah, it's secure employment, I suppose, isn't it? Talking about mud and flocculation and all that, something that we find a lot of north of the pier is these areas of concentrated mud. Why is that there? And what role might the Ribble play, or other such estuaries, in the formation of that?
So I think there's a lot of what goes on at a shoreline, which explaining things from first principles doesn't always account for it. So I'm not making that statement as an excuse, but I always go kind of like from general principles. And the general principle that I kind of always have in the back of my mind is that when you look at your tidal flow velocities in relation to tidal height, the fastest flow velocities at mid-tide and your slowest velocities are at high and low water.
Mm-hmm.
So where you get mud being deposited is as the tide slows down as it's coming in, it reaches close to high tide, it goes through high tide, and then it starts to go out. But during all of that period, the flow velocity is so slow that particles can settle on the bed. So that's where your clay is likely to be accumulating on the bed. And the same would happen in the window either side of low water. It would happen down on the outer shoreline as well. So I think what you're observing here is the deposition of fines in that window either side of high water or low water, where the clays will settle on the bed. But then, of course, as the tide starts to drop, it's gaining velocity, starting to drop a bit further, it's gaining velocity. So it reaches a certain threshold where it can pick up all of that mud again. So it tends to leave mud around the higher parts of the tidal flat, and it will leave mud around the margins of deeper channels. It might even leave mud in an entire shallow water small channel. So it's almost like morphologically constrained by this interaction between tidal flow velocity and tidal height.
Are there any spatial limitations to that, in that we find a lot of mud north of the pier, but south it tends to be firmer sand? Is that because of the distance from the Ribble? Is this process taking place at a much smaller spatial scale?
Potentially, but I think so. Yes, I'd say yes. That there's a potential for that. But we've talked a lot, or I've talked a lot. We've talked a lot about the influence of the tide, but we shouldn't necessarily ignore the influence of waves. And where you have waves which are unobstructed as they come to the coastline, they're able to pick up material from the bed, especially fines from the bed. But if those waves are being prevented from accessing space because of a structure that's in place, their energy becomes diffracted. So it's not so easy for waves to pick up those fines if they're in the lee of a structure. So in an open part of the coastline, they're pretty good. In a sheltered part of the coastline, they're not so good. So if you think about it in terms of where waves may be sheltered in this location, you could possibly think of the pier as having a marginal effect on that. So you're comparing south of the pier compared with north of the pier. Potentially the pier can have an influence itself there.
Right.
I'd be reluctant to use that as the explanation, but that's, I think, an additional factor as well. It's an open coastline as opposed to something that lies in the lee of something. Yeah, especially with that south to north transit of the tides, which is that's where the waves are superimposed upon that in terms of direction too.
Talking about waves. Now, I know that the type of waves vary depending on the angle of the beach.
What are those types of waves, Thomas?
Well, that was my next question for you. So, the interview. So, yeah, well, I know we're plunging, breaking, surging, and collapsing waves. Not necessarily in that order. As we talked about, we have a very flat beach here.
Yeah.
What role does that flat beach play on the type of waves that we have here at Southport?
Yeah. So the type of breaker that you get, not necessarily the type of waves, but the type of breakers that you get. The two factors that really influence that are wave period and beach slope. So wave period is about, if you were to observe the coastline and watch successive wave crests coming in, the wave period is the total amount of time from one wave crest to move to the position of the previous one. So that's almost like a completion of the cycle. So wave period and then beach slope are the two main influences. Where you have a shallow sloping beach, it's most likely that you have something called a spilling breaker. And a spilling breaker is one where it just breaks at the crest. There's not much vertical downward pressure that comes from that, but there's still some energy that's lost from the sea surface to the seabed. So spilling breakers are kind of characteristic of these shallow sloping, extensive beaches. Whereas if you have a much steeper beach and one that is much coarser, like a steep gravel beach, the waves become attenuated much more quickly, and so there you're likely to get things like collapsing or plunging breakers as a result. And then when you have artificial shorelines in front of a seawall, that's where you're going to get surging breakers that actually might not break at all. So that was a long answer to your question there, but the shoreline that we were describing earlier on in terms of being extensive, shallow sloping, is known as a dissipative shoreline, where energy is generally lost from the sea surface to the seabed through these spilling, sometimes plunging breakers. So there would obviously be periods during maybe swell that's coming in, longer wavelength waves, or maybe during storms when you get a different type of breaker which kind of are arching over and then plunging downwards. So a dissipative shoreline kind of has these spilling and plunging breakers as opposed to the other sorts, but spilling is much more common.
We try to recover as shallow as possible with the boat because we want to reduce the influence of the wave on the recovery process, because I think that energy input can create some challenges when recovering. So we recover nice and shallow, and we find that those waves they've broken, and then it's almost like the swash that comes up, particularly with the D-class where you can recover a lot shallower. But I wouldn't like to try and recover it under plunging breakers. Those high energy waves that roll. I think that would be quite challenging. We'd have to look at different ways.
Yeah, you'd adapt to.
Yeah.
The challenges you face. I mean, it's definitely our most dangerous part of any launch is getting our boat back on its trailer, back on its carriage. And,
it's interesting to see how different stations have adapted to the beach they operate on. Net recoveries with lifeboats, so driving the boat.
That tends to be more if on a steeper beach, because obviously as the carriage goes off that shelf, the carriage dissipates and the tractor's still, sometimes the tractor can be out the water and it's still deep enough for the boat to recover onto the carriage. So it probably wouldn't necessarily work here because we'd have to take the launch vehicle a lot further out to sea to get enough depth for us to be able to drive on and do a net recovery. So and then in that instance, we're the wrong way around on the carriage for half a mile coming out the tide, then back to station before we can do the get it on a turntable.
So we have had to adapt to that.
Can you? Sorry, just to check. Can you make a decision sometimes in terms of whether it's worth not necessarily trying to recover post breaking, but whether you can go through the surf and try to recover prior to breaking, because it's almost to some extent on some sea states, you can actually be beyond the surf and it's still quite predictable. Not on many sea states, but I'm just thinking in terms of, okay, if it's too difficult in the surf zone and it's getting problematic in the post surf area, can you actually then go beyond, especially when you've got such a flat shoreline?
Yeah, we recover by putting crew in the water to then
I see.
guide the boat on.
Yeah.
So I think if you were within or further offshore of the braking zone, then it wouldn't be feasible, especially with some of the smaller crew members. I think that's probably the right answer. They disappear under the water.
Yeah.
In the past, we don't not so much anymore because we've got better launching equipment than we did. But in the past, it wasn't uncommon for us to recover at Ainsdale,
Right.
where it's not as shallow. There's a bit of a steeper grading. So most people who launch their pleasure boats and fishing boats on the Sefton coast launch at Ainsdale. We're probably the only people, or we are the only people who launch at Southport, really.
Yeah. I remember from a job we had a few weeks ago, or it might have been training exercise, can't remember, where you were on the helm and you were talking about how the waves were almost suppressed by the wind. The wind direction was coming from the east, and normally we have a westerly is the dominant direction here. But from the east, you find that the waves aren't as high. The wave heights aren't as big. Why is that?
So that's generally because of a phenomenon known as fetch. Fetch is, in essence, the distance over which the atmosphere comes into contact with the sea surface. So depending on the direction that your winds are coming from, you can either extend or shorten your fetch. So here, for example, if your winds are coming from the west or the southwest, your fetch tends to be longer than if, for example, they were coming from the northeast. And so as a result of that, when you have greater fetch, you have more energy being transferred from the atmosphere to the sea. The energy that you see in the sea, where the waves are and where the waves are breaking, comes from the atmosphere. So it's that interaction between the atmosphere and the sea that creates waves. So if you make the fetch longer, you're giving the atmosphere more opportunity to transfer its energy into the sea, and then the waves finally deliver all of that energy at the coastline. So the phenomenon that you were just describing there is just, to me, a nice illustration of fetch for this part of the coast. If we look at it from a east coast perspective, westerly winds have the opposite effect, because the fetch would be the reverse way around. We need winds coming from the east to generate large waves, which is actually quite rare. That coastline, although being erosional, actually doesn't have that many conditions where it generates lots of storms with big waves, because winds aren't often directed from the east. They're much more prevalent from the west. So that's something that I suppose works against us in a way, in terms of having higher waves as a result of that longer, more extensive fetch because of directions from the west and southwest.
Makes for a much more comfortable journey, doesn't it, on the boat?
Well,
Especially the D-class.
Well, it depends which direction you go, and if you're going with it's generally quite nice as soon as you turn back into an easterly wind and come back towards shore. It can get a bit uncomfortable. It's not rough, it's just you just get bashed around all over the place.
Yeah, that's one thing that I found really interesting from the job that we were on the other day, in the D-class, where the boat, big boat, we call it big boat, the Arctic 24, went further offshore, and you and I, we were in the surf zone, and how much calmer it appeared closer to the shore compared to offshore. So when we did our search patterns offshore, you could really feel it. But then when we were closer to the shore, it was a lot calmer. It's only a few, tens of meters difference, so 100 meters or so difference, but the conditions were completely different. I suppose that comes down to that dissipation of energy in the waves.
Yeah, absolutely right. As you come through the surf zone, let's say you're coming from offshore to the shoreline, as you come through the surf zone, that's where most of that energy transfer is taking place. So when you're post-breaking in the shallower water, where you've really only got, they're not actually waves, they're bores, they're shock waves that are left after that, then you've got much lower energy because most of the energy loss has already taken place through the breaking process.
Okay, so we've talked a bit on the past and present. What might the future look like? So I know we have lots of monitoring taking place in the coastal zone. How might the beach profile change in response to storm events in the future, as well as increased sea level rise? And how does the current monitoring that takes place within our region contribute to that knowledge gain, I suppose?
Okay. Probably the most complex question you've asked now, but that's a good thing. The first is how a beach is going to respond to things like sea level rise, changes in wave climate, and changes in storm frequency. I would say that there's currently a huge amount of debate about this, not just from an academic point of view, but also from an environment agency point of view. Anybody who's kind of like trying to think about designing schemes, local authorities designing schemes. There is a general rule that's applied that sea level rise causes the shoreline to retreat, something called the Brun rule, and it maintains its profile. So if this shoreline was to respond to sea level rise, it wouldn't get steeper and it wouldn't get shallower. It would maintain its equilibrium profile, but it would want to migrate it inland with sea level rise. Well, I don't know where it's going to go because we've got a seawall, you've got a lake, you've got a town, and so it's hard for those shorelines to respond dynamically in the way in which they'd want to respond. So as a result of that, you get beach lowering, you're likely to get erosion of your coastal defences, and so it leads to a problem. Shorelines generally that have been developed aren't dynamic enough to be able to respond favourably to sea level rise or changes in storm magnitude and frequency. And as a result of that, you get beach loss. So there's a number of coastal scientists out there that say that sea level rise is the death knell for most beaches around the world. And indeed, the surfing industry hasn't got much of a lifetime either, because things will get too deep in the near shore to be able to surf safely or conveniently. But then there's a whole lot of other coastal scientists that say, "Hey, hold on, the coast's much more complex than that. It just doesn't have this equilibrium profile that moves landwards. We've got to think about sediment. We've got to think about interactions that take place at the small scale." So literally, there's these people. They're not slagging one another off, and they're not shouting at one another, but they're having informed debates out there in the public domain that shows that we don't necessarily know. But we can learn a lot from monitoring. We can learn a lot from looking at historical evidence of how our shoreline has responded to sea level rise over the last 200 years or so. So there's simple historical evidence, but there's monitoring data that comes as a result of having all sorts of different tools at our disposal. Just south of here at Formby and Ainsdale, we've got a long history of the council monitoring the beach profile in a number of different locations, and so they've got a really good record of how that beach has lowered, increased in volume, how Formby Point has eroded, but the wings of it to north and south have grown out. And that's happened by just taking quarterly or monthly beach profiles. But we've now got a huge range of tools at our disposal, which includes differential global positioning systems to get a three-dimensional pattern of the beach, not just a profile, but what it looks like in 3 dimensions. We've got airborne LiDAR, we've got satellite radar, we've got land-based radar. So there's a whole lot of technologies which are building a much better evidence base in terms of what happens to shorelines over the longer term, what happens to them seasonally, what happens to them after a storm. And so, to be honest, it's revealing entirely new behaviours that we've never had information on before. So it's almost as though the technology has advanced us to a level where we can kind of go back and reinterpret how coastlines work. And I think that's really valuable. Just to go back to your original question, is that with that better monitoring data, you've got a better insight in terms of how they respond to not just sea level rise, but I think more importantly, storms. Storms tend to erode, and then you get the build back of the beach during the interstorm period. So if you made storms more frequent, there wouldn't be that long interstorm period for the beaches to build back again. But that's kind of going from a first principles point of view. We should be able to determine that from the new technologies which are out there for monitoring what goes on.
And what kind of timescale are we looking at for these changes? Is it a lifetime or is it beyond that?
Some of those responses could be instantaneous.
Right.
You can get systems which are so disturbed as a result of a storm that it takes a lot of recovery, many years of recovery after that. So it depends on the severity of the event. There's been some work done on the sequence of extreme events as well. So if you have 2 or 3 storms in succession, it could be almost game-changing for a shoreline in terms of recovery. It takes a lot longer to recover from that. But we also have to acknowledge that beach volumes change seasonally. They change between summer and winter. I'm sure you'll have observed that. And that balance will be shifting as a result of climate change as well. So I think it's quite hard to pinpoint what our timescales of change are going to be, because it could be from a single event, or it could be a winter versus a summer. It could be a sequence of events, or it could be long-term changes like changes in wave climate, changes in the depth of nearshore waters driven by sea level rise. So I can't answer that one, I'm afraid.
You'll have to ask. You could answer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You'll have to ask Mystic Meg if she's still around to do that.
Yeah. Even if she is, but yeah.
No, because we've seen it ourselves, haven't we? Storm events at Formby. Well, storm events and the response of the dunes towards Formby to those storm events, where you create these sort of micro dune cliffs from high tide combined with storm surges and wave onsets and all that kind of thing, and how quickly it can alter the landscape at the very short scale. Yeah,
I know it's ancient past, but when I first started at Liverpool University in 1990. Within about 2 months of starting, there was quite a nasty storm surge in the northwest, and at Formby it took out between 12 to 15 metres of dunes. Retreated them to that extent. And what it did, it uncovered, sometimes they put fences or Christmas trees and whatever in front to try and cause the dunes to accrete. And what you could see is on that single event, it had kind of taken out probably about 16 or 20 years worth of dune accretion.
Wow.
Just in that single event. Well, that's okay if you have a storm once every 20 years, because it means you erode it and you get 20 years for the dunes to build back out. Erode it, dunes build back out. But you increase the frequency of extreme events, then you get a net recession, a net erosion that takes place as a result. So I always remember that. I think it was, I wasn't sure whether it was a characteristic of this coastline that it would retreat by that amount on single events, but that's quite a rarity. It's much more likely to be like you say, the smaller extents of erosion, the microcliffs, rather than the whole dunes being pretty much taken out as a result of the storm.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you very much, Andy. I think we'll leave it there. Have you got any other questions?
No, it's brilliant. No. So we all need to love the marsh and the beach.
We do indeed.
I think
that's the takeaway from today's podcast.
A cool takeaway. Andy Plater said, "Love the salt marsh on the beach." Like all of a sudden, I'll get loads of hate mail.
No, thank you very much for joining us.
You're very welcome.
It's been really interesting to learn about some of the processes that we witness and experience ourselves that you might put down to knowing through local knowledge, but to have some sort of explanation for it has been really, really useful. So thank you very much for joining us.
Welcome. Really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.